Everyone's heard about Rorke's Drift, that famous last stand where a handful of soldiers somehow held off wave after wave of Zulu warriors. But what most folks don't realize is that, just a few miles away, something far worse was happening. For more than 2 months, roughly 1,700 British and colonial troops were stranded deep in hostile territory, cut off from the world and surrounded by the mighty Zulu nation. They weren't just battling warriors with spears and shields. They were fighting hunger, disease, and the slow, gnawing dread that crept in day after day. This is the story of the Siege of Eshowe, a forgotten chapter of grit and endurance where the deadliest foe wasn't an army, but the fever and despair festering behind the walls of a makeshift fort. Every sunrise brought another day of misery. Mud, rain, fear, and the crushing weight of survival stacked against impossible odds. It's January of 1879. The British Empire, at the height of its pride, decides to pick a fight with the Zulu kingdom in southern Africa. Sir Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner, decided the Zulus posed a threat to the empire's control, so he found a reason to spark a war, certain that modern rifles and polished discipline would make short work of native resistance. Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford drew up a bold plan, a three-pronged invasion straight toward the Zulu capital, Ulundi. One of those prongs, known as No. 1 Column, was commanded by Colonel Charles Knight Pearson. His orders seemed simple enough. March in from the coast, fortify an old mission station at Eshowe, and wait for the rest of the campaign to catch up. On paper, it was supposed to be an easy operation. In reality, it turned into a nightmare. Colonel Pearson was a career man, steady, seasoned, and practical. A veteran of the Crimean War, he wasn't exactly a flashy commander, but he was dependable. His column looked like a patchwork army. Regular British infantry, the Buffs, and the 99th Regiment, alongside all kinds of colonial units. He had with him a hardened naval brigade, sailors and marines dragging 2 cannons, a Gatling gun, and even a set of rocket launchers across unforgiving terrain. Mixed in were volunteer horsemen, mounted infantry, and 2 battalions of the Native Contingent, or NNC, local African soldiers led by British officers who were never quite sure they could rely on them when things got ugly. All told, Pearson's force numbered about 5,000 men, counting the hundreds of civilian wagon drivers wrangling an enormous supply convoy that stretched for miles. On January 12, 1879, Pearson's men began the miserable job of forcing their way across the swollen Tugela River into Zululand. It took 2 grueling days just to get everyone over. Once they made it to the far bank, they set up camp, and by the 18th they were pushing inland. The march was punishing. There were no proper roads, only rutted trails and thick bush. The summer heat pressed down like a wet blanket, and every river crossing turned into a logistical nightmare. The wagons crawled forward inch by inch. Tension was thick enough to taste. One officer later wrote that every night they circled the wagons, guarded the flanks, and braced for attack, knowing full well that unseen eyes were watching. The Zulus knew every inch of that land, and their scouts kept constant watch. While the British saw empty hills and quiet valleys, Zulu messengers were already running to their king, Eshowe, with every detail of their advance. The Zulu monarch was no fool. He was a tactician through and through, and he had no intention of sitting idle while the Redcoats marched unchallenged toward his capital. He split his forces, sending detachments to intercept each of the 3 invading columns. While his main army, more than 20,000 strong, moved to confront Chelmsford's central force, a smaller but still deadly contingent of around 6,000 warriors was dispatched to stop Pearson. The inevitable clash came on the morning of January 22nd. Pearson's column had set up camp near the Nyezane River when a handful of Zulu figures appeared on a distant ridge. Thinking it was nothing more than a scouting party, Pearson ordered a company of the NNC to chase them off. But it was a trap. As the NNC climbed the ridge, the crest suddenly exploded with movement. A dark wave of shields and spears surging forward with terrifying speed. The main Zulu army had been waiting for that moment. Caught off guard and terrified, the NNC broke ranks and fled, leaving their European officers standing alone to face the roaring charge of thousands. Down in the camp, the crack of gunfire snapped everyone to life. Pearson, though caught off guard, didn't waste a second. He'd been a soldier too long to freeze up when things turned ugly. Within moments, he had a firing line formed and ready. The naval brigade scrambled uphill, dragging their cannons and that brand-new Gatling gun. A fearsome piece of machinery that could spit lead faster than anyone had ever seen. They set up on a small rise with a perfect view of the open ground below. As the Zulus charged, the hill erupted in smoke and thunder. The air filled with the crack of Martini Henry rifles and the deep thud of artillery. Then came the Gatling gun, a mechanical roar that chewed through the attackers with terrifying efficiency. The Zulus, fearless as ever, kept coming, but the crossfire was too much. The field turned into chaos. Smoke, dust, and the awful rhythm of men falling. No matter how brave they were, the warriors simply couldn't close the distance. They wavered, then broke, leaving the hillside littered with the fallen. More than 350 of them. Pearson's own losses were small by comparison. 10 men dead, 16 wounded. The Battle of Nyezane was over, a clean, sharp British victory. To the men on the field, it seemed to prove what they'd always believed, that discipline, training, and modern firepower would always win the day. But while Pearson's men were congratulating themselves, 60 miles away, that illusion was being torn to pieces in one of the worst disasters the Empire had ever seen. Pearson, of course, knew nothing of that. He was feeling proud, even relieved. His column had passed its first big test. The next morning, January 23rd, they marched the last few miles to their goal, the old mission station at Eshowe. Eshowe sat high on a broad plateau, about 2,000 feet above sea level. It was a peaceful spot, a few sturdy brick buildings surrounded by gardens and orange trees. There was a church, a schoolhouse, a small home, a little piece of England, dropped right into the wild heart of Zululand. But for a soldier, it was a tactical nightmare. The site was hemmed in on 3 sides by low hills, all of them close enough for enemy marksmen to make life miserable. Still, morale was high, and Pearson wasted no time turning the mission into a fortress. His men dug trenches, built earthworks, and reinforced the walls. On January 25th, feeling confident, he sent a convoy of empty wagons back toward the Tugela River to fetch more supplies, a simple logistical move that would, in time, prove fateful. Those men would be the last ones to leave Eshowe before the trap closed. 2 days later, on January 27th, a messenger stumbled in with a strange and unsettling note from Lord Chelmsford himself. The message told Pearson to disregard all previous orders and act however he thought best to save his command. Oh, and by the way, he might be facing an attack from the entire Zulu army. It was a chilling message, not for what it said, but for what it didn't. There was no mention of victory, no updates from the main army, just that vague, ominous warning. Pearson read it again and again, his stomach turning. Something was horribly wrong out there. The next day, another messenger arrived, exhausted, half-starved, and carrying the full, terrible truth. On January 22nd, the same day Pearson had fought at Nyezane, the main Zulu army had completely destroyed Chelmsford's central column at Isandlwana. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops had been wiped out in a single afternoon. It was the worst defeat the British Empire had suffered in a generation, a shock that rattled every corner of the empire. When the men at Eshowe heard the news, it hit like a punch to the gut. In one awful moment, they went from being the proud spearhead of a confident invasion to a stranded outpost in enemy territory. The main force was gone. The Zulus, fresh from their stunning victory, now had the freedom and the momentum to turn their full strength toward Pearson's small, isolated camp. Out there on that plateau, we were cut off completely, a lonely island in a sea of hostile land. Pearson knew it, and he knew he had a brutal choice to make. Chelmsford had given him permission to retreat, to try to fight his way 40 miles back to the Tugela River. But that would mean abandoning the wounded and leaving behind tons of supplies. It would look like panic, and might even invite the Zulus to pour into Natal itself. The other option was to stay put, dig in, and hope help would come before the enemy did. Neither path was good, but one of them would turn Eshowe into a legend. The order was clear. Dig in, fortify the mission, and hold out for as long as it took. Praying someone somewhere would send a relief column before it was too late. It was a huge gamble. Nobody knew when help might come, or if it would come at all. Pearson called his officers together, the mood heavy but determined. After a long discussion, the decision was made they would stay put. No retreat, no running. They'd turn that lonely little mission station into a fortress and stare down the entire Zulu kingdom if they had to. That single decision changed everything. The quiet rhythm of camp life vanished overnight. Suddenly, every man in the garrison was working like his life depended on it, because it did. The easy chatter was gone, replaced by the constant scrape of shovels and the thud of picks in the dirt. Captain Warren Wynne of the Royal Engineers took charge of the construction, and under his steady leadership, the sleepy mission began to transform into a stronghold. Wynne's plan was methodical. He marked out a rough rectangle around the mission, about 200 yards long and 50 wide, enclosing the church, schoolhouse, and the surrounding buildings. Then the digging began. Thousands of men carved a deep trench around the perimeter, tossing the dirt inward to form a solid earthen wall. They packed the wall tight, reinforcing it with sandbags, biscuit boxes, and whatever scraps of timber they could scrounge up. Soon it stood 6 feet tall, a barrier of hardened mud and sweat. Into that wall they cut loopholes, hundreds of them, perfect for rifle fire. The mission buildings themselves were woven into the defense line, with the sturdy brick church at the heart of it all. That church became both a fortress and a sanctuary. Its windows filled with sandbags, its tower turned into a lookout post, and its pews cleared to make room for the wounded. Supply wagons were hauled inside and arranged in smaller defensive rings, creating fallback positions in case the outer wall was breached. But Captain Wynne wasn't satisfied with just walls and ditches. He turned the ground beyond the trench into a nightmare for any attacker. Sharpened branches were woven into thick barriers called abatis. Wire was strung low across the ground to trip advancing warriors. And most grim of all, they dug wolf pits, deep holes lined with sharpened stakes, covered with thin mats of grass to disguise them. Anyone running across that field in the dark would never see them until it was too late. By the time they were done, the approach to Eshowe looked peaceful from a distance, but it was death itself up close. To finish it off, they cleared the surrounding land for nearly 800 yards in every direction, leaving no trees or tall grass where an enemy could hide. It was brutal, backbreaking work. And as the days dragged on, more and more Zulus began to appear on the hills nearby, silent, watchful, and patient. Before long, the camp was surrounded by nearly 5,000 warriors, commanded by local chiefs and one of King Sechweo's half-brothers. The king, still smarting from the bloodbath at Rorke's Drift, had learned a hard lesson. This time he gave strict orders. Don't attack the fort. Instead, encircle it, cut off their food, starve them out. So for the first and only time in that war, a modern British column with rifles, cannons, and a Gatling gun found itself trapped in a traditional siege against men armed mostly with spears. By early February, the transformation was complete. The mission was now a fortress, officially renamed Fort Eshowe. And now there was nothing left to do but wait. As the weeks wore on, the siege settled in. Life inside Fort Eshowe turned into a kind of gray, grinding routine. The rush and adrenaline of battle were gone. What replaced them was worse. The slow, constant pressure of time, hunger, and fear. Outside the walls, the Zulus kept their distance, watching patiently. They'd learned their lesson from Nyezane. No more open charges into rifle fire. Instead, they waged psychological warfare. Zulu marksmen, using rifles captured at Isandlwana, crept close under cover and took careful shots at anyone careless enough to show a head above the parapet. At night, eerie war chants rolled down from the hills, echoing through the dark. A chorus of haunting cries meant to wear the garrison's nerves thin. Sometimes the voices would mock them. "Take good care of our king's cattle," they'd shout, laughing. "We're coming to fetch them soon." To break the monotony and keep morale from collapsing, Colonel Pearson sent out small raids now and then, quick strikes to gather information or supplies, and to remind the men that they weren't just waiting to die. But the most dangerous enemies weren't out there among the hills. They were inside the fort with us. First came the rain. Endless, pounding rain that turned the entire camp into a sea of mud. Tents collapsed. trenches filled with water. Most of the men ended up sleeping under wagons, wrapped in wet blankets, with the rain drumming on the canvas above them night after night. Nothing ever dried. Boots rotted. Rifles rusted. The air smelled of mildew and sweat. Then came the hunger. With supply lines cut and no word from the outside world, Pearson had no choice but to ration what little they had left. Meals grew smaller, thinner, harder to stomach. And with that, the long misery of the siege truly began. The army rations, those dry biscuits and slabs of salted meat, didn't stand a chance in the damp air. Private John Cooper of the 99th Regiment remembered it all too well. "The biscuits we were given turned green with mold," he said, "and the salt meat was crawling with maggots before we even got it into the pot." Still, men forced it down. Hunger didn't leave room for pride. When the tea, sugar, and tobacco finally ran out, small groups risked their lives venturing beyond the walls to gather wild spinach or roots, anything that might fill their bellies. When that failed, they turned to the animals. First the oxen went, then the horses, then the mules. Every slaughter felt like another step backward into desperation. But the worst enemy wasn't hunger. It was the sickness. Crammed together in wet, filthy quarters, surrounded by mud and waste, men began to fall ill faster than the doctors could count. Dysentery swept through the ranks, followed by typhoid fever. The tiny church hospital overflowed, its pews long replaced by rows of feverish bodies. Supplies ran out almost immediately, no quinine, no clean dressings, no rest. On February 1st, the first soldier died of disease. After that, it became routine. Burials happened daily, sometimes under the crack of Zulu rifles from the hills. The sick list soon passed 200. Men grew pale, skeletal, and hollow-eyed. One survivor later wrote, "The hospital huts were full, and we buried men almost every day." Then, just as despair seemed to close in completely, a miracle appeared. A flash of sunlight on a far-off ridge. Early in March, sentries spotted it. A heliograph, signaling in Morse code from more than 20 miles away. The men scrambled to answer, rigging up their own makeshift device from a shaving mirror and a telescope lens. When the message came through, hearts lifted. A relief force was forming and would begin its march on April 1st. For the first time in weeks, there was real hope. A reason to keep digging trenches, to keep standing watch, to simply stay alive. Back in Natal, Lord Chelmsford was a man disgraced. His failure at Isandlwana had shattered both his army and his reputation. Determined to redeem himself, he gathered a new force. More than 5,600 men, heavily armed with artillery and Gatling guns, and set out to rescue Pearson's stranded column. The advance began on March 29th, and progress was painfully slow. Chelmsford wasn't about to repeat his mistakes. Each night, his men halted to build a fortified camp before marching on at dawn. By the evening of April 1st, the weary lookouts in Eshowe's church tower could finally see the faint flicker of campfires on the horizon. The relief column was only 10 miles away. Hope spread through the fort like wildfire. But the Zulus weren't done yet. King Eshowe had sent another massive impi, nearly 12,000 warriors, many of them veterans of Isandlwana, to destroy Chelmsford before he could reach Eshowe. At dawn on April 2nd, the British camped near a place called Gingindlovu. As the mist lifted, one officer noticed what looked like a dark line of bushes along a ridge, until a scout beside him whispered one chilling word, "Impi." The Zulus came at a run, spreading out to encircle the camp using their deadly horns of the buffalo formation, the same maneuver that had slaughtered the British months earlier. But this time, Chelmsford was ready. His men were entrenched, ammunition stacked high, fields of fire wide and clear. At 300 yards, they opened up. Volley after volley cracked through the morning air, joined by the boom of artillery and the clattering roar of the Gatling guns. For 20 long minutes, the Zulus charged with breathtaking courage, but sheer bravery couldn't overcome that wall of lead and smoke. When their attack began to falter, Chelmsford gave the order. His mounted troops burst from the defenses and thundered into the broken ranks. The Battle of Gingindlovu ended in a rout. Chelmsford had his redemption, and the road to Eshowe was finally open. The Zulu army was shattered, leaving more than 1,000 dead scattered across the field. British losses were almost nothing by comparison, just 2 killed and around 50 wounded. From their hilltop fort, the men at Eshowe could hear the distant thunder of the battle and see faint clouds of cannon smoke drifting along the horizon. They watched with pounding hearts, praying the outcome would favor their rescuers. Colonel Pearson, desperate for news, even managed to signal Chelmsford using the heliograph, letting him know the result before the general himself had the full picture. The path was open at last. The next morning, April 3rd, the relief column began its final march toward the fort. As they drew near, the pipers of the 91st Highlanders lifted their instruments and began playing "The Campbells Are Coming." The sound floated up over the muddy ramparts, reaching the fevered garrison like a dream. Men too weak to stand dragged themselves from their beds just to see it. When the first ranks of redcoats marched through the gates, the 70-day siege of Eshowe was over. Grown men, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and half-starved, broke down in tears. They had held on. Against every possible hardship they had survived. For the relief troops, the sight inside the fort was shocking. The garrison looked more like a hospital than an army. The men were little more than skeletons in filthy rags, their faces gray with exhaustion. One observer wrote, "They were worn to ghosts." Of the roughly 1,700 people trapped in Eshowe, around 80 had died, and nearly all from disease. In fact, of the 28 men buried at the fort, records show that 25 fell to illness rather than Zulu spears. Even after rescue, more would die from the sicknesses they'd carried through those long weeks. Chelmsford took one look at the place and made his decision. Eshowe had served its purpose, but it was too exposed, too hard to supply. He ordered it abandoned. The same men who had spent months turning that mission station into a fortress were now told to tear it down. On April 6th, the combined forces began their march back toward the Tugela River. That night, as they looked back, the sky behind them glowed red. The Zulus had returned and set the empty fort ablaze. Among the dead was Captain Warren Wynne, the brilliant engineer who had designed much of the defense. Exhausted by endless labor during the siege, he had fallen ill and was too weak to march. He died on his 36th birthday, carried in a wagon and buried on a quiet hillside overlooking the river. So what had it all been for? Strategically, the siege of Eshowe achieved little. The British ended up right where they started. Yet its significance was far greater than any ground gained. In the dark days after the catastrophe at Isandlwana, the endurance of Eshowe became a symbol of British resolve, a story of courage, patience, and engineering skill in the face of hopeless odds. For more than 2 months, a small, isolated force had held out deep inside enemy territory, tying down thousands of Zulu warriors and proving that, even in disaster, the empire could endure. The siege of Eshowe wasn't a tale of one glorious charge or a single heroic stand. It was a slow, grinding ordeal, an everyday fight against hunger, disease, despair, and fear. It reminds us that the hardest battles aren't always fought with bullets or bayonets. Sometimes, they're the quiet ones, fought in mud, rain, and silence, far from any cheering crowd. The 70 days at Eshowe stand as a forgotten epic of the Anglo-Zulu War, a testament to endurance and the stubborn will to live. Like so many overlooked stories of history, it deserves to be remembered. If this story of survival against impossible odds moved you, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more deep dives into the lost corners of military history. And tell us in the comments, what other forgotten sieges or battles would you like to see explored next? Because in the end, the defense of Fort Eshowe isn't about victory or defeat. It's about endurance, the kind that pushes ordinary men to do extraordinary things. While Isandlwana told a story of shock and loss, and Rorke's drift became a symbol of short, desperate heroism, Eshowe was something different, a marathon of misery that showed the real, brutal truth of colonial warfare. In the end, the men who survived weren't hailed as grand heroes. They were survivors, living proof that sometimes victory isn't about glory or conquest. Sometimes it's simply about having the strength to walk away.